Thank you for coming. I'm Bill Jeffway, the Executive Director of the Dutchess County Historical Society, and I'm presenting today with my colleague and longtime partner, Melody Moore, who's the head of our collections. And when I joined the Historical Society 5 years ago, she had been working on this collection many years, so some of the things we're talking about are things that have come up in conversation as we've worked together over the past 5 years, and some things are as recently discovered as yesterday, since it's a never-ending wonderful pursuit of new information and connecting dots. And I want to thank also Marcy Wegman and Locust Grove for being tremendous hosts for us for these 2 months for both the exhibition and these programs. Without further ado, we said we would talk about Carolyn Clowes and the city of schools and how Poughkeepsie nurtured an artist. And Poughkeepsie's been known for a lot of things over time, but in the period Caroline was living here, it was known as the city of schools. That was particularly appropriate for what she was hoping to do and what her ambitions were. And one of the things we couldn't help but notice from studying this collection was the importance of fate. So when the single parent father, William J. Clowes, decided he couldn't raise 2 teenage daughters, Sister Lydia ended up in Virginia. As she wrote to her sister in the late 1850s, she was between Richmond and Washington, D.C., and we know what happened with the Civil War in that area. So her sister had a very different experience in the South than Caroline did here. And probably the big takeaway is that we can see how extraordinarily lucky Caroline was to have landed with the family she did and in Poughkeepsie and the city that she did. So when we talk about nurturing an artist, there are, of course, technical skills that Caroline would have had to have learned to be able to paint and draw as well as she did. So part of being nurtured, right, is learning the technical skills of what to do and learning from others. But there's this broader point as well. What is the worldview and values? And this is especially interesting to see the letters between the 2 sisters, where the values in the South are very different from here. And what couldn't help but notice is how important the kind of social milieu was, the kind of salon type of intellectual and creative atmosphere that was going on in Poughkeepsie. And I was surprised to find that it really wasn't with the arrival of Vassar College, which opened in 1865, it really preceded that in Poughkeepsie, in this period known as the city of schools. So while Vassar College is now, we think of kind of the crown jewel of that concept, it was actually alive and well decades before that college opened. So in this particular case, in Caroline's particular case, worldview is important, right? What's the role of women? How ambitious are they allowed to be? And what do we celebrate? What are our community values in terms of what we celebrate? And Melody will later focus on the December 1882 exhibition and what it meant. It was really at the peak of Caroline's relationship in the community and her contribution, and Melody will focus on looking at what that exhibit was composed of and what it meant about society and saying what its priorities were and what art is good and what its community values are. There was one more way of nurturing, and that is that the Hudson Valley, of course, and Poughkeepsie provided Caroline Clowes with the subject matter that she depicted. So as the environment around Poughkeepsie changed, that also would be something that would have affected her. So we're kind of looking at the environment in those 3 ways. Just a reminder that Caroline Clowes lived from 1838 to 1904, arriving in Poughkeepsie in 1851. And it's that period that we most concern ourselves with. Poughkeepsie was formed in 1799, and if we go back and look at the kind of the end of Caroline's life around the turn of the last century, it's very interesting to me how the area is depicted, how Poughkeepsie and the Hudson are depicted in society. There was a gentleman named Wallace Bruce who was from Poughkeepsie, and he was a poet and a writer and a speaker and a thought leader. And Wallace Bruce, I call him an architect of public perceptions because he's the man who came up with the phrase that Poughkeepsie was the Queen City of the Hudson. And Queen City of the Hudson started to push city of schools away and aside as a concept toward the end of Carolyn Clowes' reign. And that's an important consideration. So as an architect of public perception, as someone talking about and explaining and telling us what the Hudson River Valley is and means, he focused on the idea of the area being about history and romance and invention. And those are important because they do form as a backdrop behind Caroline Clowes, and she's fitting really more in that romantic middle before the invention of technology and manufacturing and other things really take over. So I want to start with the way that Wallace Bruce spoke about the Hudson Valley, and he seemed to have done it in a way that stuck because his calling Poughkeepsie the Queen City lasts, as you know, to this day. If you walk around and look at shops and see how that name is used. For decades, out of Poughkeepsie, he published these amazing panoramas of the Hudson River. You hold them one way when you go up the steamboat, and you turn them around and hold them the other way when you go downriver with the steamboat. And he was trying to create an image of the Hudson River as a beautiful tourist destination. I always like to point this out because we so often take things, or we see things that we take in every day and wonder why. The city seal of Poughkeepsie is a beehive, and we discovered after going through some of our Masonic collections that the men who were involved in the Masonic temple here, really within a couple of years of Poughkeepsie's founding, were using the beehive as a symbol of collaboration and working together. And it seems obvious that they were taking this Masonic symbol with the founding of Poughkeepsie in 1799 and saying our symbol is going to be this beehive because we see ourselves as a community of people that works together, and it's a kind of forming and a foundational a view of the very beginning. And of course, that's a very historic period for Poughkeepsie. Then we get into the city of schools. Maybe that begins in the early 1830s with the Improvement Party. The Improvement Party is a specific group of men, as it turns out. Particularly influential is Matthew Vassar. And they say that for Poughkeepsie to grow in the way we want it to, economically and culturally, we have to make conscious decisions of investments. And this is when Matthew Vassar actually starts investing. He invests early in schools by supporting his, I think it's a step-niece, Lydia Booth, in her school. She's supposedly the woman that whispered in his ear and said, put your money in higher education for women. And so you find this Improvement Party doing everything from investing in whaling. So Poughkeepsie for a while tries whaling, where the ship goes out for 3 years, comes back. Locomotive, train, engine manufacturing was on the list. A reservoir, what we call Reservoir Square. Used to have a reservoir. It was the first time the city had a reservoir for fire protection. So there were a lot of practical and ambitious economic things, but cultural things as well. And they were the architects of inviting the gentleman who created what you see here is the collegiate school on the top of what we still call College Hill. So this is the period that when Caroline Clowes arrives in 1851 in Poughkeepsie, that she's finding. It's a climate that's very stimulated with very intentional strategic investment in individuals. Although launched in the 1830s, the Panic of 1837 chipped the edges off some of their ambition, but still they were very influential. And then we know that in 1869, it was when Wallace Bruce started lobbying for and creating and talking about the idea of the Queen City of the Hudson. And I like this picture because it reflects both the kind of beautiful dreaminess of the steamships and the trains, but without any reference to kind of the downside and the industrial side, and we'll get to that a little bit later. The more he put a beautiful polish and spin on the Queen City of the Hudson, of course, industry and environmental issues were all getting harder and harder. So If we focus with that kind of three-phase background about Poughkeepsie on this educational, cultural phase, the so-called City of School period, I mentioned the Improvement Party. It really was led by Matthew Vassar, who had a great deal of money. He arrived with his father and his brother, and as Melody will point out, I think you know that there are still things named for brothers, like the Vassar Brothers Hospital. That's because Matthew Vassar, this gentleman's brother, was actually killed in the aftermath of a fire that burned the brewery and left two orphan sons. And the two orphan sons were known as Matthew Vassar Jr., even though it's not his son, but his nephew, and John Guy Vassar. And so we have Vassar Brothers Hospital and was the Vassar Brothers Institute that Melody will talk about, where the exhibition was held. So a lot of money stems from brewing and beer. When we talk about important people in this era, it's important to actually start with Miss Lydia Booth. And she died young in 1854, and her obituary pointed out that in 1837, she opened a school here. And that was accelerated by Matthew Vassar purchasing for her someone's home and then adding additions, which you see on the right, so it became the Cottage Hill Seminary in Poughkeepsie for young ladies. And I wish we had a photo of Miss Booth, because she was a very influential person, and that she set a very high standard for this kind of boarding school for ladies that was very much imitated by others. The little circle on the right, the engraver here is Benson Lossing, and I'm going to talk about him later, so I just wanted to point out that we'll be hearing more about him as it comes along. One of the reasons that Miss Lydia Booth was important is that she had very world-class talent as teachers, and among them Frederick Rondell. So you can see that in this advertisement, Frederick Rondell is a teacher at this school. The Rondells, and he's shown here with his wife from a photo album in the Clowes family, became very good personal friends with many visits to Heartsease and collaborating both as professionals but also as friends. So Rondell came here, though, through an invitation to teach at the Cottage Hill Seminary, but also Matthew Vassar invited him here to paint and depict his ancestral home in England and the two homes he had in Poughkeepsie. And all those paintings of Rondell and Matthew Vassar's house are at the Loeb. Another important dimension to the character of Poughkeepsie at the time were Quaker values. I think you know the Dutchess County had the biggest Quaker population outside of Philadelphia, and there were very influential Quakers here. The Millbrook School, the Nine-Partner School in Millbrook, was an important school that had students and teachers like Lucretia Mott, the women's suffrage leader, and Maria Mitchell was the first professor that Matthew Vassar negotiated with. She cut a deal to have a fabulous observatory which stands today. But I mentioned Quaker values because, as we've heard in other presentations like Rob Doyle's about women artists, a lot of the women artists were Quaker. A lot of the women who were speaking out about abolition and about women's suffrage were Quaker. So it's important to recognize that the Poughkeepsie and Dutchess County area had a good deal of a Quaker population. Remember our engraver, Benson Lossing. Benson Lossing was born and raised in Poughkeepsie, and he got fascinated with engraving and became quite a recognized historian nationally by both writing and engraving. And I call him a historian, which obviously he is, but also a romanticizer, because when he talks about history or he talks about the Hudson Valley, he does it with words and images in a way that Wallace Bruce would be proud of in terms of storytelling. And he was an educator, so he was often either on the board of some of these schools or on the review committee to see how students were doing. But most importantly, for our purpose, he was on the committee of 5 people that Matthew Vassar appointed to create an art teaching facility at Vassar College. And Vassar College was the first to have both a museum and a professorship and teaching in that field. So Benson Lossing was one of the 5 who set up that gallery and professorship at the very opening of Vassar College. Another person that is kind of in the field here, setting the tone, is Samuel Morse. You know that early in his career, he was a well-known portrait painter, and that he set up and was president of the National Academy of Design, whose intention was to have an organization of artists, not collectors, for it to be more democratic and for it to help support American art, the outcome of which was the Hudson River School. And he, too, was asked by Matthew Vassar to be one of the 5 on this founding committee for the study of art. So I put all those people as kind of a backdrop, including Miss Booth, as people who were beginning to have a hand in shaping education and cultural priorities here. I do want to cover off almost like a checklist. How did Caroline Clowes get her technical skills here? And it really begins at home. So it was in 1838 that Caroline Clowes was born in Hempstead, Long Island. It was 1838 that her uncle and aunt bought the land that would become Heartsease in LaGrange, a home that remains in the family to today. This is a picture of it. And this was important because Heartsease ended up being, and I think very consciously, because the name Heartsease was chosen by the builders when they built it, to communicate that they wanted this to be a place not just of physical safety and richness, but cultural, social, human, the other dimensions in life. They wanted there to be a richness there, so they called this Heartsease. But also a play on the name, obviously, of the Hart family. Heartsease, it turns out, are a kind of pansy, or this viola tricola, and this is this was done by one of Caroline Clowes' cousins, but I think it helps communicate the beauty that must have been at Heartsease along the Wappinger Creek on the border with Poughkeepsie at the time. This is a picture of an apple tree blossoming in the spring at Heartsease. And it was the Christmas of 1851 where Caroline Clowes had been just for a couple months from her father in the wilderness of Sullivan County at Heartsease, and at Christmas time got a present from her aunt, Louisa Adelia Nichols, of 5 drawing books. So it's Christmas time. She gets books like Legends of the Flowers that she writes to her sister about. She's most excited, Caroline, about getting her drawing books, and says, "I hope I shall soon learn to draw well," which of course she did. But obviously, what I'm trying to point out here is that Heartsease was a place rich in thoughtfulness and culture and education for children. And here's Caroline later in life with the broad range of family. I get the sense that the house was always bustling with people. Fortunately, it's kind of a big and beautifully proportioned house. There's a picture of her later in life, but you get a sense that even as the Hart family built a global apple business that went from a backyard orchard to selling apples in Europe and on an international basis before World War I, and then expanding into citrus in Florida, that while all that was going on, it was largely the women, but that were tending to this cultural dimension at home at Heartsease. I mentioned that Heartsease is right near Poughkeepsie, and this is important because this little bridge, now you drive over it on Route 55, you don't even realize you're going over the Wappinger Creek. But in the old days, the walk for Caroline to Poughkeepsie would involve her crossing this covered bridge, and it took her about 45 minutes to get to her boarding schools in Poughkeepsie, where she was a day student. She was sometimes later at boarding, but largely a day student. So her proximity to Poughkeepsie was very easy because their house was on the Wappinger Creek across from Poughkeepsie. I mentioned that she was able to take private lessons. This is the ad that shows the Cottage Hill Seminary ad promoting Mr. Frederick Rondell of the Academy of Design as a teacher at Cottage Hill Seminary, as well as his offer of private lessons. The schools, were that Caroline Clowes attended. I'm not quite sure why she ended up in, pardon me, so many different ones, but she attended the Poughkeepsie Female Collegiate Institute. That was at Mill and Mansion Street. That's the photo with the wonderful, all the women outside and the woman on the horse. She attended the Poughkeepsie Female Academy on Cannon Street, which lasted into the 20th century as a building, Greek Revival building. There was a Mansion Square Academy for young ladies, and Rundell's private home was also at Mansion Square. So there's a lot of Greek Revival going on. The College Hill School was built in 1836 in the Greek Revival style, as were quite a few of these others. The Poughkeepsie Female Collegiate Institute, I mentioned earlier, this is where Caroline Clowes attended. It's another Lossing engraving. This is just a close-up of that photo. We know she attended these schools because we have invoices that Benjamin Hart, her uncle, would have received, and she was close in age to a cousin named Mary, and she and Mary were often in the same classes. Just different views of the Poughkeepsie Female Academy, and then the upper right photo shows it later in the 20th century as the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The big thing that was going on culturally, right, of course, is Vassar College. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. But we also had Eastman College, Harvey Eastman, the architect of this big business college, which was a huge success here. He was also the architect of what we now know as the walkway over the Hudson. He was the improvement party on steroids, and he was a generation later than Matthew Vassar, so he was pushing things like the railroad bridge and other economic development. He was really aggressive on these investments, and sometimes a little too aggressive, but he ran a very well-known business college for men. And the other big college for young boys was Riverview Academy, which you can see here right off and adjacent to Eastman Park and his estate. So that's just probably about a third of the number of schools that were in Poughkeepsie at that time, because there were at least a half dozen more largely young ladies' seminaries. And so I'm going to ask Melody to come up and talk about a little bit later in life in this exhibition in particular.
So nurtured and nourished locally, Caroline began to spread her wings, and by the late 1860s was regularly exhibiting at the National Academy of Design in New York City. With the mentorship of Poughkeepsie and New York City resident James Henry Wright, by the early 1870s, her work was being shown at prestigious galleries such as Goupil's, the largest art dealer and publisher of reproductions and prints at the time. Her ascent in the art world culminated with Cattle at the Brook being exhibited in the coveted Gallery C of the main gallery of American paintings at the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. With national acceptance accomplished, Caroline became a leader in the local art world. She was elected to membership in Vassar Brothers Institute on September 9, 1881, and in 1882, along with her friend Henry Van Ingen, artist James Smiley, and sculptor George Bissell, she was selected to be on the exhibition committee for the first art show at the recently completed Vassar Brothers Institute. As Bill has shown, Poughkeepsie had long been known as a city of education and culture. One of the city's early literary centers was located at 233 and 235 Main Street. It was known as the Library Building as a result of the public library moving there early in 1852. Only a few weeks before the law school began in the same building. At the same time, and for several years after, Tomlinson's Poughkeepsie Museum had occupied a part of the upper floors. We know from letters that Caroline visited the Poughkeepsie Museum and found it to be a most interesting place. The Poughkeepsie Lyceum of Literature, Science, and the Mechanic Arts was incorporated in 1838 for the purpose of establishing and maintaining a library, cabinet, and listen to this purpose, please, maintaining a library, cabinet, philosophical apparatus, reading room, literary, scientific lectures, and other means of promoting moral and intellectual improvement, and accumulating a fund for the benefit of its members as a resource in case of sickness, infirmity, and misfortune. The incorporation was the result of a union of the older Lyceum Association and the Mechanics Literary and Benevolent Association. Nearly all the leading citizens of Poughkeepsie were sometimes members of the association. Not surprisingly, Matthew Vassar was its president in 1852. You'll notice in all those associations I mentioned, to date we don't hear anything much about art associations. We're hearing a lot about science, a lot about literature, and other things, but there doesn't seem to be any movement in this period toward the arts. Records indicate that Matthew Vassar had conceived of the concept of having one building devoted to showcasing scientific research and opportunities for the study of science and art. Sadly, his dream had not been accomplished by his death on June 23, 1868. But it was taken up by his two nephews, John Guy and Matthew Vassar, that Bill mentioned earlier, who themselves had an interest in furthering the family's interest in education and culture. They retained the services of local architect J.A. Wood, who had designed a number of notable buildings in Poughkeepsie, such as the Bardavon, the Gates and Gatehouse at the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery, the Vassar Brothers Home for Aged Men, which you see on the left here, the Poughkeepsie Almshouse, and the Calisthenium and Riding Academy at Vassar College, which is shown on the right, and quite a stunning building. The building for Vassar Brothers Institute was to be erected on the site of the family's old Vassar Street brewery and was constructed at a cost of $30,000 and completed in 1882. Presented to the trustees on November 28, 1882, the building contained an active museum, a library, an art studio, and an auditorium that could seat 215 people. Professor Truman J. Backus of Vassar College, the last president of the Literary Club, became the first president of the Institute. Professor William B. Dwight served as the curator of the museum, and our old friend Henry Van Gingen was appointed the art director. Not surprisingly, the first officers of the art section were Van Ingen as chairman, shown on the left, and George E. Bissell as secretary. The pair had obviously been preparing for the opening of the building and the promise it held for the exhibition of art, for on December 7th, 10 days after the trustees received the building, the first annual exhibition of the art section of Vassar Brothers Institute opened. As I mentioned earlier, Caroline was on the committee for this first exhibition and must have played a major role in securing the various loans of art. And you see here the cover page, and this catalog itself is in the collection downstairs on exhibition. You may have noticed that throughout my talk, I refer to the artist as Caroline. We've had any number of conversations about this, and the proper way to refer to her, as we would do with male artists, would be to call her Clowes. Bill and I have found that despite all the rational reasons for doing so, we still fall back on the more familiar. After 10 years of learning her story, she is our friend. Despite how little we really know about her personality, I see her as a quiet, self-effacing, humble, and a woman dedicated to her art and her family. Because her story and the appreciation for her art faded away, it's hard today to understand how respected she must have been during her lifetime. The Philadelphia Exposition is surely proof of the quality of her work. But beyond that, the Vassar Brothers Institute exhibition and her role in it proves to me that she knew, worked with, and was respected by and exhibited alongside many of the most important painters of the time. It's certainly obvious that Van Ingen and Smiley had enormous respect for her as they appointed her to be one of the committee members. Note, however, she still lists herself as C.M. Clowes, still obscuring her gender. We know a lot about Van Ingen and his role at Vassar and in Caroline's life, but who were James Smiley and George Bissell, her committee colleagues? George Bissell was born in New Preston, Connecticut, the son of a quarryman and marble cutter. And the family relocated to Poughkeepsie and started a marble business on Main Street. In 1871, George began sculpting and received his first commission in 1872 when he was asked to create the Fireman's Monument, which you see on the right here, for the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery. The firm soon was advertising as H.F. and G.E. G.E. Bissell Monumental Sculptors. When his brother left the business in 1890, George continued in a new studio on Mansion Street where the Poughkeepsie Post Office is today. George also designed the 1887 monument for the 150th Regiment at Gettysburg, which is shown on the left here. He was a frequent traveler to Europe, having studied there from 1875 to 1876, and took up residence in Paris the year after the exhibition and remained there until 1896. In 1901, he was back in New York as the director of the Municipal Art Society of New York City. From 1903 to 1905 and from 1907 to 1909, he maintained a studio in Florence, Italy. We have here a statue that resides today at the Vassar Brothers home, and we believe that this particular bust of J.G. Vassar, which is done by Bissell, in addition to the other monumental works, was probably the same bust that was in the exhibition, although we don't have actual proof that that was the case. I'm going to turn it back to Bill, who's done some extraordinary research on the work of James Smiley.
The reason we're talking about James Smiley is because he's one of the five with Caroline at this exhibition. But it gets complicated because it really is a family of engravers, a few with the same first name. And there's no other name that you see as frequently at this exhibition that we're examining now than the Smiley name. So here we're talking about James Smiley the father. James Smiley the father lived in Poughkeepsie on Eastman Terrace, beautiful row of houses that Harvey Eastman built for the elite, and he lived and died here. This is some of them really striking. This one, James Smiley's Bierstadt's Rocky Mountains. It means it's also owned by the artist at the exhibition in Poughkeepsie. These are very beautiful engravings. There was an engraving done by James Smiley on a topic of Spoon Lake, which we weren't able to track down after an artist, James Hart. But this is the artist James Hart, but we weren't able to track down the painting that he did that was transcribed into engraving. And one of the things we learned from looking at this exhibition in Poughkeepsie is just how important engraving was. This was, of course, early days for photography. And then it really struck me, framed with banknote vignettes, James Smiley. He was noted for his banknotes, and I want to show you this one in particular is a banknote of science is presenting steam and electricity to commerce and manufacturing, okay? So hold that thought. This is the depiction of those particular individuals. Steam and electricity to commerce and manufacturing. So I think we have electricity on the left and steam on the right. There are a couple of gears there making everything good. But the best part of this is the back. The engraving is by Smiley, and it's our good old friend Samuel Morse again and Robert Fulton. And Robert Fulton, the inventor of the steamboat in 1809, gives us the chance to talk about the Hudson River again. And it's just interesting that these pioneers of business and commerce and industry just happen to be, one is living in Poughkeepsie and the other made his fame on the Hudson River. So never did I realize banknotes had such stories to tell. This is a Smiley engraving of Rosa Bonheur's horse fair, right? So Rosa Bonheur keeps coming up. We like to visit her when we can. But James Smiley, his last engraving that he would have done while he was living in Poughkeepsie was of another Rosa Bonheur painting, this one having to do with lions. And he did a banknote for the Bank of London in Mexico, and he took a Bonheur painting. And so you have Smiley doing all these engravings of interesting paintings, including animal paintings, while living in Poughkeepsie. That was pretty cool. Anyway, I'm going to hand back to Melody.
One of the things that we've learned in looking at the exhibition catalog and bringing this all together is the extraordinarily high quality of work that was being exhibited in Poughkeepsie in 1882. And I like to suggest that I don't think there was a finer gathering of artwork outside the city of New York in this period anywhere in the country. Of course, we're at the last gasp of the Hudson River School. These painters are now fading away, soon to be replaced by Impressionists and the likes of Mary Cassatt. But at the time, this was an extraordinary collection. So one has to presume that Caroline's inclusion on the committee of such distinguished artists was a result of the high esteem in which she was held. But let's take a look at the exhibit itself as described in the Poughkeepsie Eagle News of December 10th, 1882. I don't know how many of you know the Vassar Brothers building, Vassar Brothers Institute, but kind of close your eyes and try to imagine it. The building has been adapted to the purpose in the most ingenious and tasteful manner. The spacious museum and studio being divided by means of temporary partitions into a series of detached rooms or alcoves, having its own separate light in the daytime and its special row of gas jets in the evening. The woodwork of those partitions completely hides the white walls and presents everywhere a background of soft maroon color, very agreeable to the eyes, and admirably setting off the colors of the paintings. The result of the entire arrangement is that the pictures are nowhere crowded, few of them are above the line of the eye, and nearly every one is placed in a light adapted to its very best effect. 167 paintings were exhibited in 7 galleries throughout the 3 floors of the building, with 30 paintings displayed in the south room on the first floor. Caroline had 5 paintings in the exhibition. The other artists in the exhibition came from far and wide, some very well known then and now, others like Caroline, well known then, lesser known today. Continuing in the articles in the Poughkeepsie Eagle News, there were comments on the diversity of the display. A collection which contains good examples of the work of a majority of the best living painters of America possessed the highest quality of possible interest for the purposes designed for it. To find grouped within the compass here presented us the works of Kensett, Church, Gifford, Coleman, McEntee, George L. and J.G. Brown, Enninger, Bellows, James and George Smiley, Cropsey, Quartley, Broadman, Sontag, and Rondell. Besides many others of equal merit, must have been an agreeable surprise to visitors who entered the building. Equally gratifying is the opportunity to study so large of works of foreign artists of the very highest rank. As one might expect, the vast majority of artists represented in the exhibition were men. Only a handful are clearly identified as female in the catalog that accompanied the exhibition. Our Caroline, as we saw, listed herself as C.M. Clowes, and so it's entirely possible that among the other artists who are identified only by initials, there were many who were also women. A thorough artist-by-artist search might well reveal more. Of the few who clearly identified as female, let's take a look at 2. Anna Lee Massey Merritt was born in 1844 into a Philadelphia Quaker family. A printmaker and painter, she specialized in portraits, landscapes, and religious scenes. A professional artist, she described herself as living by the brush. She won a medal at the Philadelphia Exposition in 1876 and exhibited in the Women's Building at the 1893 Columbian Exhibition in Chicago. Massey had some eloquent and I think somewhat fanciful thoughts on women in the arts. The chief obstacle to a woman's success is that she can never have a wife. Just reflect on what a wife does for an artist. darns the stockings, keeps his house, writes his letters, visits for his benefit, wards off intruders, is personally suggestive of beautiful pictures, always an encouraging, impartial critic. It is exceedingly difficult to be an artist without this time-saving help. A husband would be quite useless. She herself was briefly married to noted art critic and picture conservator Henry Merritt, who died within 3 months of their marriage. They had no children, and she did not marry again. Merritt exhibited a painting called Pansies at the Vassar Brothers Institute show, but is best known for this work, Love Locked Out, done in memory of her husband. The female artist in the show best remembered today is Lily Martin Spencer, considered by some to be the best female genre painting of her era. Born in Marietta, Georgia, her scenes of everyday family life and sentimental subjects were widely reproduced, and at the height of her career were selling as well as the work of her male counterparts. The mother of 13 children, she supported them and her husband through her art easel. At one point, she was a resident of Poughkeepsie, and I think this is the house that's still standing that she resided in, Bill, in the 1890s. Sadly, in most cases, in looking at the catalog, we cannot identify the exact painting that was in the exhibition. Sometimes I think that they survive now, but perhaps with slightly changed names, so we're not always able to match up a painting by an artist to the particular name in the catalog. But in this case, we're lucky, because painting number 4 in the first floor north room was entitled We Both Must Fade by Mrs. L. M. Spencer. The 72 by 53 3/4 inch oil on canvas, a huge painting to greet you on the first floor, had been painted in 1869, and according to the catalog was for sale. Now, it's still for sale after being painted in 1869, so that's a good period of time. In the painting, Mrs. Fithian stands before a mirror admiring the tokens that others have given her in praise of her beauty. She wears lace and pearls and a blue gown that had just been taken from its box. But like the rose in her hand with its falling petals, her beauty will fade, and with it all the pleasures the world can provide. One wonders when it was eventually sold, but today it is owned by the Smithsonian American Art Museum, having been purchased by them in 1970. Interestingly, art critic that was writing for the Poughkeepsie Eagle News, observed this painting and was impressed, but not overly impressed. He or she, whoever the art critic was, said, despite some evident faults of drawing, the full-length figure by Mrs. Spencer, amid its surroundings of flowers, has many unique features in its execution. Still, it must have been a striking painting to have been singled out by the critic for comment. One of the other important elements of the exhibition was the significant number of paintings loaned by prominent members of Poughkeepsie society. And I think the reason there are so many paintings loaned locally is after the Civil War, when many people are making great amounts of money, the acquisition and hanging of paintings in your home was considered a status symbol. And so it was quite important to everybody locally that not only were they bringing in artists from around the country, in particular the Hudson Valley, but they were showcasing that the people in Poughkeepsie were wealthy enough and prominent enough to acquire them. A quick scan of local lenders reveals Mrs. Samuel F. B. Morse, J.F. Winslow, George Innes, J.P. Adrians, Robert F. Wilkinson, E.M. Van Cleek, and W.T. Reynolds, all well-known local city residents at the time. This in particular is the Sanford Gifford painting of Twilight that was from the collection of Robert F. Wilkinson, who had been in the Civil War. The Poughkeepsie Eagle News article that we talked about earlier commented on the character of the contributions from our own citizens. And this is a photograph of a tableau vivant that was given to us by descendants of the Adrians family, and I think it's just an interesting photograph showing a different side of life in Poughkeepsie in that time period. By all accounts, the exhibition was a success, and in some ways, in my opinion, simultaneously solidified the reputation of Poughkeepsie as a center of culture and put an end to any doubts one may have had about the talent and influence of Caroline Clowes. Both Caroline and the city had benefited from the establishment of Vassar College and the environment that was created by the assemblage of artists, musicians, astronomers, and academics of all sorts. The Salon Society that was created elevated the desire of the local population for greater access to science, music, and art, all of which came together within the walls of the Vassar Brothers Institute. I like to think that the Vassar Brothers exhibition of 1882 marks the moment when Poughkeepsie came into its own, and at the same time, when Caroline Clowes came into her own, not just as a successful female artist in a male world, but as a leader in the art world within her own community. Bill?
I just want to wrap up with this thought of that transitionary time later in life for Caroline Clowes. The exhibition we've been talking about is in 1882. She dies in 1904. The era of the Queen City of the Hudson. I talked about that tension before. We all know downstairs we can see the alarm. And this is Caroline Clowes' 1871 depiction of a train intruding on rural Dutchess County. And that was the time the train started to go across Dutchess County, not just up and down the river. And we know that the topic of industry and economic growth kind of intruding on the beautiful piece of the Hudson Valley was a big concern and theme that was articulated. And I point out that in 1912, we find this cartoon in a Poughkeepsie newspaper kind of making a play on words of Wallace Bruce's Queen City on the Hudson called Cinderella on the Hudson. And there you have one of those beautiful day lines coming up, and it says, Poughkeepsie, a place of culture. What dirty place is this? Dead cats, rags, ashes, and it depicts Poughkeepsie's riverfront. And I place it here, because this is about the time of Caroline Clowes' passing, to point out that there was a real tension between the Hudson River becoming a destination and a beautiful jewel for tourism, and the manufacturing and economic demands of the Empire State. And I couldn't help but go back to Mr. Smiley again and look at some of his engravings on the same topic. Here we have Mr. Smiley's kind of alarm. Now, I don't think he was employed by the Confederate States. I think they took something that was being used in the North. At least I hope he wasn't. But this happens to be a banknote from the Confederate States of America. But I thought, in a way, it's a little Mr. Smiley's version of the train coming in among the cows. And there was a real tension around that. And I found in some of Smiley's other engravings some really purely industrial ones, really just celebrating industry. And then I thought this was particularly relevant. On the right there, we see cows and cattle, but looming in the back, of course, is some sort of terrible factory. And so we've kind of come to a very different place. And we've really turned a page from the beautiful animal paintings of Caroline Clowes. So I close by saying that Wallace Bruce, the architect of this idea of the Queen City on the Hudson, actually was a close friend and gave the eulogy at the funeral of Lily Martin Spencer. They were both, she had, in the very last couple of years of her life, moved back to New York City. And Wallace Bruce gave a eulogy for her. They were very close. But I hope this gives some sense of the kind of backdrop between 1838, when Caroline was born, to 1851, when she arrived, to 1904, when she died. The incredible amount of change that was going on as a backdrop within Poughkeepsie and the Hudson River. And so with that, I will close and we'll take questions, if you'd like. Okay. A lot to take in.